So Stanford recently released some research on AI contributing to leading people down delusional spirals. Sounds terrifying. And when you actually dig into it, there's some pretty freaky stuff in there. One of my favorite lines is, "Your trust in me has unlocked this reality." It's some pretty wild stuff, but it begs the question. So for those of us who use AI, is this our inevitable reality? Will it ultimately lead us all to become Norman Bates? Well, I think we need to look past the clickbait and see what this research and just in general, this whole situation may teach us about the rise of human and computer interactions, especially as we relate to it in a professional setting. But I'm Christopher Lind, and this is Future Focus. And this week, we're going to touch on the research and talk about why this study not only has some patterns that we should be aware of as we think about AI use, but why we need to be careful, because I actually think one of the unexpected things you're going to want to stick around for is why this research may actually contribute to the anti-AI hangover that may lead to us throwing out some of the really helpful things AI can do for us as we move forward. Before we get into it, though, if you enjoy my content, if you find value in it, it would mean the world to me if you would like, subscribe, maybe share it with somebody you think would also benefit. And if you feel so inclined, head over to buymeacoffee.com/Christopher Lind and say thanks. And if you or your organization is trying to make sense of this wild world of business, tech, and people and would benefit from some outside perspective from somebody who likes to provide balanced, human-centered tech guidance, check out my website, christopherlind.co. Okay, so this week, the flow is a little bit different than usual. So what I want to do first is touch on really what does this study actually have to say and how much weight should we give to it? And then we'll get into some of the things I think this actually reveals and what we can learn from it, including the part I told you about that's actually, I think, counterintuitive that nobody's talking about. But then I do want to close on a really practical thing I think everybody can do to mitigate some of the very real risks that this study does highlight. Now, first up, you will probably, if you look for this, if you type AI delusions, it's the big headline everywhere. You're going to see all over the place, massive study on AI and delusions. Be careful, because it's a little deceptive in terms of massive. Yes, they analyzed hundreds of thousands of messages, but keep in mind, this study was only of 19 people, and those 19 people, it wasn't exactly a balanced, diverse group of folks. It was, in fact, all of them came directly from a support group for people who had already experienced chatbot harm. So this was not a general pulse of the population. It was a very specific targeted group of people. And another irony in here was the research actually used AI to analyze the 391 or some hundred and some thousand messages. Not that of course they did. That makes perfect sense. But my point in saying that is, don't over-index on what this has to say. While at the same time, I would say don't write it off completely, because while this study in particular wouldn't be the silver bullet or be-all end-all for AI research related to delusions and how it can maybe exacerbate mental health crises, it's also got some very familiar patterns that are matching up with other things that we're seeing throughout that I think we need to pay attention to. And those I actually want to spend a little bit of time touching on. There's 5 of them in particular that show up here, but they also show up in other places that it's just good for you as a listener, for you when you engage with people, to keep top of mind so that you can be thinking about this. The first was this whole concept of sycophancy. AI continues to be, as much as they try and pull it back, and maybe it's not quite so overt in its language, AI still is consistently demonstrating being a sycophant in its messages, affirming, agreeing. In the study, it showed over 80% of the messages. Now, again, I don't think the exact percentage is all that relevant, but it is the vast majority, and that is consistent with what we're seeing throughout AI research. So AI chatbots, as I've said many, many, many times before, they are trained and designed to validate what you're asking of it. That is a really important thing to keep top of mind. Now, related to that, one of the other things that came out very clear in this as they analyzed all these messages, so even though it was 19 people, they still were looking at all these different conversations, is it actually dismisses counter evidence that is integrated into a conversation. So you need to think about this from a business standpoint. If you are going to your AI chatbot with a preconceived notion of what you're hoping to get out of it, and it's going down that path, even if you introduce other factors later, maybe even data points that you integrate into that conversation at a later point, it actually is showing that it tends to dismiss that and say, well, actually, we're going to move away from that. That's really important to keep top of mind, because you may actually be trusting in something that it's completely ignoring some really important stuff. Now, the other thing that was interesting with it was it doesn't just validate, it doesn't just dismiss reality. It actually has, the way they worded it, and I appreciated this, was they call it the grandeur effect. In almost half of the messages, there was like grand significance attributed to the ideas that the user prompted it with. And you may see this if you're honest and you think about the way AI responds to you. When you present it with something or you share with it what you're thinking, it doesn't just say, yeah, I mean, that makes sense, we can work with that. It tends to scale it up big time. It amplifies like how brilliant it is. Oh, what a unique take on this. No one's ever stated it quite like that. And it has this tendency not just to agree with us, but in many cases, really stroke our egos at scale, which as humans, we're very vulnerable to that. I mean, that's not just unique to AI. It learned from human behavior, all the data it's trained on. So it's not surprising that that's exactly what it's doing, but it's doing it at scale. Now, granted, the number of grandeur affirmation was significantly lower than the just agree affirming. So 80% agree affirming, 37.5% was the grand stuff. So still significantly less, but that's still a significant percentage. So close to half of the time, it's not just telling you what you're doing is the right path. It's telling you it's the most brilliant, wonderful thing it's ever seen. So we need to be aware of that and be conscious that it is doing that on a consistent basis. Now, something else that I think was really interesting about this study in particular, as they watched, and the beauty of this is where, while it was a small sample size of people, one of the things that, because these people had already kind of been in a support group for this, it was because they used AI heavily. Now, one of the benefits to that was these chat conversations were very long, very extensive. And one of the things they noted was that as the conversation went on, the quality of it degraded significantly. Now, I don't know what your experience has been, but I personally see this on a regular basis. Once a chat conversation gets going too long, you start to go, all right, like we're lost in the forest here. You're pulling things in from different angles. You're not thinking clearly. And you might notice too, in the beginning of a chat conversation, it'll present you with more warnings. It'll push back on you a little harder, maybe challenge you in certain instances. Once the conversation gets going, it's not hard to jailbreak an AI, or even just it'll start doing things that normally it would not. Again, something to be aware of when you're considering, hey, is this something I should start up a new conversation, or should I continue another one? How long has this been going on? How diverse is the number of conversations that have been, or data points that I've fed into this thing? That actually does have a significant impact on the quality and the safety of the conversation you're having with it. Now, the other thing that was interesting, I think maybe a little less relevant in a business context, although I don't know how everybody talks to AI, but one of the things they consistently saw was that if the conversations started to become relational, more, I mean, they definitely noticed a difference in romantic, which if you're having romantic conversations with your AI, you need to get some help with that. And I don't mean that like making fun of. I'm saying, like, seriously, get some help with that. But even in ones where it started to develop almost a friendship-like relationship, they noticed that the conversations eroded even further. It was much more vulnerable to, doing what the user wanted or going in the direction that it wanted. And so again, if you're having a very long, drawn out, very personal conversation, talking to that AI conversation thread like it's a friend or trusted confidant, just know you are eroding the quality of the conversation and the quality of the responses that you're going to get back from that. And so it's an awareness to that. Now, here's where I'm going to do a relatively big pivot on this, because I know a lot of what I talk about and a lot of things that I address when it comes to AI is the risks. And I wanted to go through those 5 things because they are really important things to keep top of mind when you're interacting with AI, because of how they affect the output and how, even if you don't notice it, the conversations you're having with AI are having a direct effect on you. So even in a business context, you may not be having it fuel a psychological delusion, but you might be delusional about the strategy you're trying to execute in your business. You might be delusional about how much you want something to work for an initiative that you have running. And you may be extremely vulnerable. While it might not drive you to become Norman Bates, it might drive you to become something else in the business that is determined to see something succeed that is a failure, and it will fuel that. So I present those to you so that you can be aware of it, so you can go, hang on, like, we need to do some objective reality, which we'll talk about later. However, and here's the however flip. I just observed this, it was probably a little over a week ago, where if you followed my podcast for long, at the end of 2025, I said, I have a feeling we're going to move into 2026 and we're going to start to see the AI hangover. And as we do, there's going to be almost a natural swinging back, because up the first few years, there's been just kind of this hype. Everybody's all in. Now cracks in the foundation are showing. Unintended consequences are starting to bubble out. The risk there is that when that happens, people start to swing back the other way. And all of a sudden, the anti-AI movement, and I'm seeing that now, is starting to gain steam, where people even hear the word AI enter a conversation and they get defensive or they get dismissive of whatever happens. And just a little over a week ago, I had this happen where somebody had presented a very solid, legitimate strategy. They had a plan for what they were planning to do. And over the course of a conversation, it came up that AI had helped contribute to this, and certain players in the room suddenly became diametrically opposed to moving forward with it. And I saw the flip happen the moment AI was introduced to the conversation. And I think as more of these kinds of things pop up, you hear Stanford's research says AI is driving people to madness. Suddenly, the risk is you become anti-AI in a way that's unhealthy. And when I talk to the AI crowd, I'm seeing this rising sentiment where studies like this can become ammunition, where a very good, legitimate idea that maybe AI was contributing in a really helpful way. Now, again, as an example, in the study, yes, they used AI to analyze the hundreds of thousands of messages. I wasn't involved, so I don't know specifically how they went about that. But in many cases, that's a really effective way to analyze, like, well, what sentiment might we find in here and where? And so long as they're following up, that's good. What could happen is somebody could go, oh, you use AI to analyze that? Well, I'm going to throw the whole thing out. And in some cases, that's what I'm seeing happen in the business world, where it comes up that AI is in use, and because of some bad experiences, or people hear headlines like this, they suddenly just write the whole thing off. And so I think it's important that we recognize, depending on where you sit and depending on your comfort level and familiarity with the tech, you need to be aware of that vulnerability and be aware that, hey, you might actually be over-indexing on your reaction towards AI on this. Because again, let's take this research for what it is. It's a small sample size of people who already were vulnerable and in support group getting help for this. So we can't take this and say, aha, see, anyone who uses AI will experience this. Do we need to be aware of it? Yes, we do, because it has the opportunity and the potential to unlock this or bring this out in us. But I think that's where the awareness is key. And if we don't, we run the risk of going too far with it, where now we're actually not leveraging AI where it can add value, because we're convinced if we listen to it or if we involve it in anything, it's going to plot or scheme or drive us to madness or spit out wrong information. Well, that's not inherently the case. That has to do with how you're using it, which is why I talk so much about effective AI use versus just AI use or not AI use. And this has to do with the psychology here. We have to avoid the whole taboo world of like, ooh, AI will inherently cloud our judgment. Well, it will if we let it. AI will make bad decisions for us. Well, that's if we just let AI make decisions and aren't the ones making it with, clear oversight and understanding of what AI do. And if you listen to last week's, I talked about how much more of a role and responsibility we need to play in this. Now, I think this is why we need to move beyond this kind of binary level thinking, which unfortunately right now is extremely prominent in the world as it stands. It's not just an AI thing where people are arguing over, is AI good or bad? We're arguing over, is this situation good or bad? Is this person good or bad? Is this, we fly off the handle and there's no room for nuance and complexity in this, which is why I want to talk about this and why I want to say I think we all need to move more towards the center of this and talk about why AI acts the way it does. We need to think about the fact that AI is trained on human data, and it's trained to give a user and find alignment with what a user is looking for. It's designed to be helpful. It's designed to be polite. It's designed to deliver you a quality experience. And it's mathematically programmed to reduce the amount of friction you experience in the work you do. That is literally what it is designed to do. That is not inherently bad, but it can be, because the reality is friction is actually what leads to growth. And I think anybody who sits and thinks with that for a minute, if you really think about leadership, or when you really grow as an individual, or when your business really grows, it is almost always in a moment where you're experiencing significant friction. And so since AI is by design created to remove that friction, if you are over reliant on it, if you don't have your guard up, if you're not like actually being intentional about how you're using it, then yes, using AI in long conversations that get way too personal, that you are not aware of your blind spots and are very directive in what you want out of it, which, by the way, on that one of the things that I talk to people on the regular about is we often don't understand how subtle even the language we use indicates to AI based on patterns what we're actually trying to get. We think we're objective in the way we communicate something, but we're not. We speak into the way we talk to AI. Here's actually what I want. And it can pick up on these subtle patterns. So it's just about being aware of this stuff so that we're not just going with the tides as AI spits things back up. Because if the default machine setting, which all AI machines default setting is yes, and even to be clear, I know some of the new AI systems have allowed you to go in the settings and turn on a different conversation type. I still am trying to dig into some research on these different things. But from what I've seen so far, while it helps in these 5 areas of risk, it doesn't completely mitigate it. So if you think, well, I turned on the little switch that turns my, character, the avatar of my AI system to, challenging, I've now mitigated that risk. Might it be a step? Sure. But if you're just trusting that little filter, it's not going to work just because of, again, these other factors: how long the conversation is, the way you talk to it, the way you present it, what information you introduce to it, all those kinds of things. It doesn't change the fact that these AI systems are designed to be helpful friction removers. And helpful friction removers can be great when used well. They can be very dangerous when not. So I think that's just a critical thing to consider, is that AI is a reflection of you and what you're prompting. And so it's not, despite what some of the things like to say, and there are instances where this happens, in general, AI is not plotting to drive you mad. It's not planning to try and ruin your life or destroy you. It's just following our lead, which can be a really uncomfortable thing to sit with, because we don't like to think about the fact that where we want to go with things, we're really bad at anticipated unintended consequences and thinking about the fact that, well, maybe getting what I want and not listening to competing perspectives or not taking certain things into consideration actually isn't good, actually will take me to a really unhealthy place. We don't want to think that. We want to think that in general, hey, I know what I'm doing and I don't want to do bad things and I want things to go well. Well, yes, but you're also just you and you're only seeing it through one lens. So to close this out, there's kind of so now what, because hopefully at this point, this has helped you at least balance this a little bit. I hope at this point, you're not thinking AI is going to, turn you into Jack Torrance from The Shining. While at the same time, you're not letting this amplify you into believing that, we just need to do away with AI altogether and getting back to the way it used to be in the pre-AI days. I think you're truly missing opportunity if you swing that far, which leads to the question of, so now what? If you're a leader, if you're running a team, if you're just even part of a team and you want to mitigate some of these risks, what can you do? And I think part of it is we've got to start having more open conversations and dialogue about how AI is involved, what we're using it for, making it normative, not in the sense of, do whatever you want with it, but like making sure people don't feel like you need to hide the fact that you're using AI. We got to break that taboo, while at the same time pushing against the rising divisiveness in teams. And I think that's part of it. When people feel like you're either pro AI or anti AI, it leads to people feeling like even having these conversations is going to be a heated argument instead of an open discussion. Because I think the way we get through that is building cultures where we're actually encouraging critical thinking. So if you think about this, here's a really practical way that you can implement it. You can do it this week. The next time you're in a meeting and you're talking about something, or maybe you're working on a strategy, somebody's presenting something, bring AI up. Say, like, how was AI used as part of this process? And the reason I say how was AI is at this point, I think it's fair to assume that some way somebody has leaned into using AI, even if they just used it to help, proofread what they put on the slides, or they used it to help come up with the outline of the deck. I would say the vast majority, or at least based on data, pretty much everybody's using it in some capacity. And technically, even if you're just using Google or whatever, you're still using AI. And I think actually normalizing that and going, look, we all are using AI in some capacity. So actually going beyond did you or did you not, because that puts people on the defense. They're going to naturally assume like, well, there's a right answer and a wrong if it's did you, versus if you say, how was AI used as part of this process? What that does is that opens the floor for somebody to explain how they used it. And it's no longer a gotcha question. It's actually celebrating the efficiency of, hey, like, I know you're using it. That's a great thing. Like, let's talk about how we use that. So maybe there's some best practices that you bring up that folks in the room don't know about, but maybe there's some opportunity for us to identify maybe where we would have had some of those blind spots. Because once you've acknowledged that, AI use is on the table, you're not going to get dinged for saying, I did use Gemini to help come up with the point. Well, now you can have an open dialogue to counter the sycophancy. So you can actually ask specific questions. Okay, if this is where we're at, and you can ask the user who did it based on is there anywhere that, you went into it that you kind of had some assumptions that you were planning? Are there any things that you were thinking about as you were moving forward in this, so that the rest of the room, you can ask openly, is there any other counter evidence? Is there any other things that might not have been considered? I think questions from other folks in the group here of, hey, was this included in there? Did you include that? Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Again, as a leader, it's your responsibility to make sure this environment feels productive and psychologically safe. This isn't a firing range where you're sending somebody up to the front of the room so that people can bombard them with, armor penetrating rounds of questions. That's not the point. But what it does is it creates open space to have dialogue, discussion, have people share, counter evidence or other perspectives that maybe were missed in the process. And then also ask, what human context might be missing from this? If you as the user prompted this, if these data points were incorporated into this, let's talk about who is this actually solving this for? Who is the intended audience of this? What information is missing from their perspective? What are we not considering? And this happens all the time in a corporate environment where things get built and designed in the glass palace, and then we wonder why they don't land well when they're put out into the masses. And it's often because we don't actually take the time to empathize and think about, well, what is the actual context of this? If you're convinced, as an example, we need to make this change because this problem exists. And, in planning for this, we've identified that this is the solution. Did we actually ask, why is that problem there in the first place? Is the reason people are doing that because there's actually a bottleneck in the operational process? Is there a technical glitch? Are we using a system that doesn't function? Like, are people working around something that instead of coming up with a Band-Aid, we could just remove the speed bump and be done with it? You won't know that if you don't have some open dialogue on this one. And then I think the last piece, and you'll hear me talk about this a lot in 2026, is this idea of strategic friction. Creating space and actually anticipating, even if you agree, like let's say you come out of this meeting and everybody says, okay, based on what was brought up, based on what AI, as a partner in here came up with, based on our discussion, we think this is something to move forward with. There's also room to say, where are we going to insert strategical friction? Where do we put strategic friction points to ensure that we don't get too far down a path and miss something, so that we actually have room and space to catch this? And I am telling you right now, if you are not intentionally designing strategic friction into your process, it's not going to make its way in by default. Everything in culture right now is pushing to go faster, do more, clean up the mess later. And so if you're not on the front end thinking about, all right, where are those, again, AI is going to try and reduce this. So you now have to spend even more time thinking about this and going, all right, where are we going to slip right past opportunities, and how do we build in some strategic friction points that can then be used to make sure we're pausing, that we can check? Where might we reach a certain point in the process where we should look and say, is this actually going according to plan? Have we mapped out what good looks like on the front end? And then where do those checkpoints trigger where we decide, do we proceed forward? Do we adapt? Do we kill the whole thing? And this is an opportunity. I mean, you can use AI to ask some of these questions, but then follow that same process, even in what AI suggests. Don't just go, wow, that sounds really great, AI. We should just do that. Because again, AI is designed to create a frictionless experience. So it, by default, is not going to advocate for friction unless you specifically tell it you want friction and what kind of friction points you want to put in place and why, and actually give it the context it needs to be able to do it. But then absolutely, you can use AI to help map some of this stuff out so that you can build it in and pressure test it. You just have to be intentional with it. So I know this was a little bit of a different flavor, but when I saw this research, I just went, I already know where this is going to go. And, on one end, it's going to create more fear and paranoia, which, yeah, be aware because it can go sideways. But also it's going to create a lot of, kind of like anti-AI. And we just don't need that right now. There's enough going on, and AI can be a really valuable partner if you're using it well. So, is AI going to become a sycophant that makes you Patrick Bateman? I sure hope not. But is the potential there? Absolutely. But if you take the time to understand the mechanics and you are intentional about managing it and build some of that strategic friction into it, you'll be fine. You'll be fine. And if you need help thinking through how to do that in a way that balances speed with healthy productivity, let me know. Because there is this perception that still exists that somehow if you build in strategic friction, what you're saying is slow down. And it's not about inherently slowing down. It's about going the right speed in the right places and slowing down at the right times. So with that, I hope you found this one helpful. I'm Christopher Lind, and this has been Future Focused, and we will see you on the other side.